So we're really excited today to be talking with Father Paul Kollman, who's a professor in the theology department and also the director of the Center for Social Concerns. Father Paul has taught here for 15 years, and I was interested in getting his opinion about the church's teaching on suffering. So Father Paul, in class this week, we've been looking at the problem of evil, and in particular, the problem that seemingly pointless suffering causes for rational religious belief. We've been looking at some philosophical arguments on the topic, but I thought it would be really illuminating to get to the source, to talk with people who have really firm religious commitments, but who are also really engaged in alleviating suffering in the world. So I thought maybe before we get into the philosophy, you could tell us a little bit about what the Center for Social Concerns does and what your work with the center has been like.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan. It's really good to be with you and your class. I took over as director of the Center for Social Concerns about 4 years ago, and I knew some about the center's work. Of course, our biggest job is involving Notre Dame students in engaged activities of academic learning that bring them face-to-face with human suffering, whether that be local occasions of people encountering poverty or inequalities in healthcare or educational opportunities, things like that, or far from here, where they go to be in partnership with communities across the country and across the world. We prioritize them understanding human suffering from the inside, really understanding people's lives close up and personal, so they have a very personal experience and encounter with those who suffer. So this is, of course, really important to me as a topic. I would hope it's important to everybody, insofar as suffering is something that touches every human life. And from a perspective of human flourishing, if you deny your own suffering and also aren't able to empathize with other people's suffering, I think most of us would think there's something a little bit wrong with you. Mm-hmm. The philosophical question that arises in readings like those you're doing with David Hume and other philosophers and theologians are vexed. They're complicated problems, especially for believers. If all suffering is the result of human mistakes or dim-wittedness or evil, then it's pretty easy to kind of figure out, oh, let's just make people better. We can solve suffering. But of course, we know there's ontic evil that is not traceable to human mistakes, dim-wittedness, or evil. So the suffering and evil that gives rise to suffering is a really philosophical conundrum.
Focusing on Hume, Hume would think it's crazy for a Catholic school or a priest to send people out and have them participate in suffering and then expect them to hold on to their religious faith. So he thinks once you realize the depth, once you properly understand the amount of suffering in the world, that should give you real pause about whether or not it's reasonable to believe in an all-powerful and loving God. So here's how Hume put it in our reading today. He puts it as kind of a dilemma formed as questions. He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but he's not able to? Well, then he's impotent. Is he able to, but he's not willing to? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then why then is there so much evil? I wonder, when you hear that argument, especially thinking about your mission with the Center for Social Concerns, where do you think Hume is getting something wrong or hasn't quite understood the problem?
I don't know if he gets things wrong. He's a great philosopher and better philosopher than I'll ever be. So I'm not sure. I think he begins from a place where we are sort of disembodied, rational processors of problems instead of people living in the world that we live in, with relationships and experiences, insights, as well as rational unfolding of our logical thoughts. This is the kind of issue in which the limits of rational unfolding alone, isolated from real human experience, are clear. Because I don't think you can solve the problem. And in some ways, living with his premises and the experiences of his life, despair may be the only option. Or atheism, which doesn't always, of course, lead to despair. As someone who's thought about this just because I live it, I think it's not a very effective way to live in a disembodied, detached way. We naturally are already always involved in people who have loved us and who create empathy in us because we respond to them in loving ways. And therefore, our own well-being is bound up with their well-being, and we suffer when they suffer. And very often suffering impinges on us directly as well. So suffering is not just a conundrum understood in a disembodied way. Suffering is a real life experience that people undergo, and each of us undergoes in his or her own life. The challenge is, what do you do with it? Do you remain detached? Do you seek to intervene? Do you seek to participate? We talk here at the Center for Social Concerns about the responsibilities and the gifts that come from engaging, from understanding the sources of suffering, from understanding and loving people who do suffer. Good things happen to our hearts and our minds when we do that kind of stuff. So our academic programs, whether they be short-term or long-term, whether they be theological or connected to another academic discipline, seek to have our students come up face-to-face, heart-to-heart, person-to-person with suffering. We think we have resources in our faith and in a university like this and in the hearts and minds of our students to make good sense of that kind of suffering and to foster in our students the right sorts of inclinations, instincts, and insights in the face of suffering.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, the way I think about it is kind of related. I think some philosophers approach the problem of evil as just this kind of like logic bomb that gets dropped on Christianity and other monotheistic religions. But I've always thought in like my day-to-day experience, it's more just a tension that you find in religions like Christianity. So on the one hand, it's not like suffering is any big surprise to Christians. It's kind of at the core of theology. One particular person's suffering is at the core of theology. A lot of people, in fact, turn to religion or grow in their faith when they're experiencing suffering, either on their own or because they witness it in people that they love, or they witness it in the world that like deepens their faith and draws them into the religion more. But then once you're in, you start thinking about God and what God's capable of in his nature, that's when the tension starts, and that's where the problem starts to build, because you think, like, where is God in this event? If God is capable of stopping it, then why isn't he stopping it? And it's a tension that I think almost any serious believer has to walk this line of how they're going to resolve it. Do you have advice for people who they think, like, they've gotten in now, they turned to faith because they thought it was going to give them the right kinds of tools for confronting and dealing with suffering, but then once they're in it, they realize they're having a hard time squaring that with their vision of who God is?
Sure. I would say a couple things. One is to create a sense in yourself of reflective thoughtfulness. We seek to create in our students actually theological reflection for the most part, since so many of our students are believers, but even for non-believing students, we seek to create in them reflective postures and resources so they can think about these kinds of issues in the most critical and thoughtful ways possible. Some of that is simply disaggregating experience. So breaking experiences down into different parts. So the suffering often encountered by our students is multidimensional. The young women who they work with, for instance, who are in situations of poverty, expecting a child and feeling very abandoned. Each of those women's lives has a long history, complicated reality. We have sent students, for instance, to places near the border with Mexico. So a lot of these women have immigrated to the United States in difficult circumstances, found themselves vulnerable. And so it engages our students in a process of education of mind and heart that draws them into real social realities because of the face of suffering they encounter in a teenage girl from Mexico, for instance. So we seek to give them resources of self-reflection, which they can be both empathic and engaged, but also detached in the right sorts of ways so that they're not overwhelmed, they're not feeling like they're abandoned without any resources to make sense of it. And we do think that the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, all sorts of religious traditions have great resources to bring to bear the problem of suffering. I mean, in some ways, Buddhism, that was the beginning, the insight of the Buddha, the enlightened one. Yeah. Those of us who are Christians do think that Jesus Christ, his life, suffering, death, and resurrection are the best answer to suffering, even if it's not an answer that all philosophers are going to find complete. It's an answer that only makes sense if you kind of trust it, engage it, live it. So we ask our students to think, to pray appropriately for where they are in their lives as they face the challenges that suffering brings to them.
This is really interesting because one common philosophical response to the problem of evil is to claim that God's justice, God's mercy, whatever moral code God abides by is just so alien or different from ours that we can't really understand, like why he permits certain things. I mean, I've always felt uncomfortable with that solution. I'm always uncomfortable with like theological or philosophical views that make God just completely beyond our possible conception, especially when it matters to our day-to-day lives. But I wonder if you've thought about this a little bit, if like you think it helps a little bit in answering the philosophical problem of evil to say that God's morality is really different than what we understand as humans to be our obligations to each other.
Yeah. This is a great question, and all sorts of Christian philosophers have thought a lot about this. Kierkegaard most famously.
Yeah, how weird is God? How morally weird is God?
That's a great question. I think God is morally weird at certain points in history, and that Revelation provides us occasions when we discern and God's weirdness is disclosed to us. Yeah. I do think God is also discernible by reason, and even maybe not God's existence or God's essence in its totality, but Revelation doesn't come to us in an unreasonable form. But God's weirdness does strike us because our reason is imperfect and unfolding all the time. I used to teach the sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah, in Genesis 22, where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his only son. And it's a beautiful literary story. It's a philosophical and theological conundrum. There's no right answer to it. Kant has one answer. Really, Abraham was dumb. Yeah. And all sorts of other theologians and others have other answers, that it was heroic for Abraham to have done such a self-denying thing, to have agreed to sacrifice his son. Again, there's no great answer that's finally going to solve this. It's the kind of mystery that invites us into the heart of human reality. Yeah. Suffering's real. For me, God is real. Indeed, I try to live as if God is real. But faith isn't the same as certainty, even though the more faith we have, the more certain we can feel about our faith, I think. But doubt never goes away. And I've been privileged to know people for whom life has been so hard that their faith in the midst of the difficulties they've faced inspires me by their heroic courage, their honesty, their ability to put their experiences in perspective and to reflect on them in ways that are very challenging to those of us who seek to accompany them in the midst of their sadness. We invite our students to that kind of programming here at the Center for Social Concerns, and we think it's a central part to Notre Dame's education. We want our students to be the best they can be, and the kinds of educational experiences we provide here are about that, about making them the best they can be. Yeah. Believers or non-believers, to encounter human suffering with the best resources of a tradition, philosophical, theological, critical theory, sociology, makes you a better citizen, makes you a better person, we believe.
One of the things we've been talking about in class is theodicies, so attempts by people in the church to come up with explanations for why certain evils occur. So you kind of mentioned one at the beginning of our interview, the free will theodicy, which is a really powerful one, which is a lot of evils are caused by the misuse of human freedom, which in and of itself is a good thing. There's a kind of a meta question, which is how important is it to have a theodicy in order to continue to address suffering in the faith? Like how much of what you guys do?
It's a great question, because theodicy I think is inevitable, but it can be more or less sophisticated, and probably it gets more or less sophisticated as we naturally grow wiser and older. Hopefully if we grow older, we grow wiser. Yeah. I do think there are some inadequate theodicies. Yeah. For instance, to blame people for their misfortune often shows a lack of empathy. Yeah. Even if we can find reasons where people's mistakes led to their misfortunes, people don't really want to be miserable. And to go against the empathy that would regard a suffering person as worthy of compassion and not contempt seems to be something we as a university have to really stand against. And I hope our peers our students challenge each other, challenge their peers when they find those kinds of attitudes. I also don't think it's random. Yeah. All the time. I mean, most of the time. I think suffering is we can discern meaning in suffering, and sometimes meaning is disclosed to us in suffering. But the important thing for me is to create a sense of reverence before others as they suffer that tends to arise when we give reverence to ourselves as we suffer. That those two kind of human realities, I think, grow together for most human persons. And if we wall ourselves off from the suffering of others by becoming immune to our own or indifferent to them because we're indifferent to our own, something is less human in that kind of a posture.
I totally agree. I mean, I think I'm kind of pragmatic about some of these issues, but I think it should be a test for a theodicy that it's not only the kind of explanation that seems philosophically satisfying, at least for certain kinds of evils, but is also an explanation that's useful in helping people deal with the evils that they're actually confronting. Some of the great philosophical explanations of evil would be completely horrible things to say to somebody who was actually walking through a period of suffering in their lives.
Yeah, certain forms of dualism, for instance, you can find certain forms of philosophical and theological dualism seek to explain suffering by, there's God and then there's somebody else causing all the suffering. I don't find those very satisfying. The Christian tradition tends not to find them very satisfying, although in some ways we're dualistic, but not in the Zoroastrian sense of dualism, that there's like a demiurge causing evil. I don't find those very compelling. I mean, karma is an Eastern religious tradition that seeks to make sense of suffering. So you put the individual life in a really long-term rebirth being possible, and gives some hope to suffering because it can end eventually and will end eventually for everyone in the scope of eternity. Again, that hasn't been what I've been raised in. It's not naturally attractive to me, but I understand the appeal of it, from Brahmanic Hinduism into Buddhism. The Africans whom I know best have explanations for suffering. The traditional African believers before Christianity and Islam, or today with Christianity and Islam, but some people continue in African faiths, they make sense of suffering through all sorts of ways, tend to be located within the communal identities of their people, linked to their ancestral traditions and to the reality of ancestors as intercessors in their current lives. That's sufficient for them. Whether those kinds of explanations and realities, kind of systems facing suffering, can endure philosophical, rigorous attack or scrutiny is another question. And I'm not sure about that. I think we're living that reality, at least in the African world the worlds that I know something about.
I want to close. This has been a fantastic conversation, but I want to close with a question we ask for all of our interviewers, which is, how does knowing philosophy or being engaged in philosophical inquiry help you in your work as an activist or somebody that's trying to mobilize people to, really practical, direct action to alleviate suffering and change the world? How does philosophy help you in that kind of vocation? It's
a great question. I'm going to sort of give you an answer that talks about social participation.
Okay.
Because I think philosophy, I kind of prefer to think of philosophy as pursuit of all knowledge in the oldest sense of the word. But as an academic discipline at a university like the University of Notre Dame, it seems to me the precise value of philosophy is helping people understand the bases of what they care most about and arguments to argue from those bases to real life positions. Whether those be how you live your own life, how you participate politically, how you raise your family, how you pray. Traditionally, 80% of our undergraduates are Catholic, and we're glad to have that be the case, and we seek to be a place where their faith grows here. But it's not going to grow for most of them unless it's challenged. So philosophy makes them think really hard about the sources of their faith, the bases of their faith, the implications of their faith. But it also helps them think critically about the other disciplines in which they participate: engineering, architecture, sociology, accounting. So that philosophical reasoning, understood properly, ought to infuse all of those disciplines and help our students be rigorous, thoughtful people.
This reminds me of a passage from John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, where he says, if you have any conviction or idea that you really believe is true, then you ought to know its grounds. And the best way to find its grounds is by confronting just the best objections. Put it out there in the marketplace of ideas, let people argue with you, and find the grounds of your belief.
Yeah, Hume, really right. That's why, interestingly, you began with Hume. He really is a philosopher I like.
Yeah.
And I always did, because I feel like he's a realist. Hume is, in some ways, a very interesting realist. And sometimes our students get in trouble, and everybody gets in trouble, when we don't acknowledge reality.
Yeah.
We project upon things that aren't there, and we ignore things that are. Yeah. And Hume tried to really take serious account of what was real. And so I like him.
I just love that he asks the tough questions,
He
even
does.
even when it's kind of uncomfortable, even when he's possibly going to get fired from his job. He's willing to go after the questions that really matter.
He really
to people.
almost was.
Yeah,
I mean, he had to kind of
yeah.
hide his convictions during his own life, right? Which is fascinating. We only discovered some of the things he cared most about after he died.
Well, Father Paul, this has been phenomenally edifying. I was really glad that we got
thanks.
to talk about this. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Professor Sullivan. Thank you very much, Megan. Good luck with this class.
Thank you.
All right.